The night it happened, everything was quiet. The big gates of the Adeyemi mansion were closed, the lights were dim, and the whole house was asleep. Then suddenly, loud banging at the door. Not just one knock, hard, angry pounding. Before anyone could even understand what was going on, police officers rushed inside. Flashlights cut through the dark hallways. Boots echoed on the marble floors. One officer shouted, "Kofi Adeyemi." Kofi came down the stairs confused, still in his night clothes. "What's going on?" he asked. His voice was shaking, but he tried to stay calm. "You're under arrest for embezzling millions from Adeyemi Construction," an officer said, snapping cold metal handcuffs around his wrists. "Embezzling?" Kofi's heart dropped. "That's impossible. I didn't take anything." "Dad, tell them." He looked at his father, Solomon Adeyemi, the powerful owner of the family construction company. His mother stood beside him, holding her robe tightly. Neither of them moved. Neither of them spoke. "Dad!" Kofi's voice cracked. Solomon didn't even look upset. He didn't argue. He didn't defend his son. He just stared at the officers and said, cold and calm, "Take him." Those two words hit harder than the handcuffs. In that moment, Kofi understood something worse than the arrest. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't confusion. His parents were not going to save him. As the police dragged him out into the flashing red and blue lights, neighbors peeking through their windows, Kofi realized the truth. He wasn't just being arrested. He was being abandoned. If you go back a few years before that midnight arrest, the signs were already there. Kofi just didn't want to see them. Growing up in the Adeyemi house was never equal. Damilola, the younger brother, was always the favorite. If he made a mistake, it was called youthful energy. If Kofi made the same mistake, it was called disrespect. At family dinners, their father, Solomon Adeyemi, would proudly talk about Damilola's brilliant ideas. Even when those ideas were half finished, Kofi could work twice as hard and still barely get a nod. Still, Kofi loved his brother. He never competed. He just focused on the company. Adeyemi Construction was supposed to be their legacy, their future. Then one afternoon, while reviewing company accounts, Kofi noticed something strange. Large transfers, offshore payments, projects that existed on paper but not in real life. At first, he thought it was an accounting error. But the more he looked, the worse it got. He walked into his father's office with the files in his hand. "Dad, something isn't right," he said calmly. "Millions are missing. We need to check this before it becomes a problem." Solomon's expression changed for just a second. Not shock, not confusion. Something else. Then he leaned back and said, "Are you accusing your own family?" "I'm trying to protect the company," Kofi replied. Damilola was in the room that day too. Quiet. Watching. He didn't say much. Just crossed his arms and stared at Kofi like he had already made up his mind about him. Few days later, everything exploded. The board received anonymous documents, bank statements, contracts, transfer approvals, all signed in Kofi's name. His digital signature was on every page. Emails from his account authorizing payments. It looked perfect. Too perfect. Kofi stared at the papers in disbelief. "This isn't mine. I didn't sign this. Someone forged it." But the damage was done. The real shock came in court. When the trial began, Kofi expected at least one person to stand beside him. Just one. Instead, he watched his own parents walk to the witness stand. His mother avoided looking at him. His father spoke clearly and confidently. "We trusted our son with company funds," Solomon said. "We are deeply disappointed." Disappointed. Not confused. Not unsure. Disappointed. Kofi felt like the floor disappeared under him. This wasn't just a legal case anymore. This was betrayal. Carefully planned. Cold. Personal. And as he sat there listening to his parents testify against him, one painful thought kept repeating in his mind. They didn't just believe the lie. They chose it. The courtroom was packed the day the sentence was announced. Reporters filled the back rows. Cameras waited outside. Everyone wanted to see the fall of the perfect son from the powerful Adeyemi family. Kofi stood there in a plain suit that suddenly felt too heavy on his shoulders. He hadn't slept the night before. Not because he was afraid of prison, but because he still couldn't understand how his own life had turned into this. The judge adjusted his glasses and began reading the decision. His voice was calm, steady, almost emotionless. He talked about breach of trust, about corporate responsibility, about millions of dollars missing from Adeyemi construction. Every word felt like a hammer hitting Kofi's chest. Then it came. Given the scale of the financial crime and the abuse of position, this court sentences Kofi Adeyemi to a lengthy term of imprisonment. A loud murmur spread across the courtroom. Kofi didn't react at first. He just stood there, frozen. The words didn't feel real. Prison. Years of his life. Slowly, he turned his head toward his parents. His father, Solomon Adeyemi, sat straight, face stiff, jaw tight. No tears. No regret. Just silence. Then Kofi looked at his mother. For a second he hoped, just 1 second, he hoped she would look at him, that she would see him, not the headlines, not the accusations, but her son. But she didn't. She lowered her eyes, adjusted her handbag, pretended to read something in her lap. That hurt more than the sentence. The guard stepped forward. Turn around. Kofi slowly placed his hands behind his back. The cold metal cuffs snapped shut around his wrists. The sound echoed in the silent courtroom, felt final, heavy, permanent. As they led him out, reporters rushed to the doors. Microphones stretched forward like weapons. Do you regret stealing from your own family? How could you betray your parents? Was it greed? By evening, every news channel had the same headline. The greedy son. His picture flashed across screens. Social media exploded. Strangers who had never met him called him selfish, ungrateful, a disgrace. No one asked if he was innocent. No one asked why a successful man would suddenly steal from his own company. As the prison van door slammed shut, Kofi leaned his head back against the cold metal wall and finally let one tear fall. Not because he was scared of prison, but because he realized something far worse. The world believed the lie, and the people who could have stopped it chose to let it happen. Prison was nothing like the courtroom. There were no cameras, no headlines, no speeches, just noise, heat, and the heavy sound of metal doors closing again and again. Ikoyi Correctional Center became Kofi's new world. The first night was the hardest. The cell was small, crowded, and smelled of sweat and rust. The mattress was thin. The air felt heavy. Somewhere down the hallway, 2 inmates were arguing. Somewhere else, someone was crying. Kofi lay on his back staring at the ceiling, thinking about the mansion he had slept in just weeks before. Marble floors, air conditioning, silence. Now, survival meant something different. In prison, you learn fast. You don't talk too much. You don't show weakness. You don't react when someone tries to provoke you. The first time someone shoved him in the food line, he almost lost his temper. But he remembered something his father once said about business. Control is power. Funny how that lesson followed him here. There were fights, sudden and ugly, over food, over space, over pride. Kofi got pulled into one during his 2nd month. He left with a cut above his eyebrow and a new understanding. Nobody cares who you were outside. In here, your last name means nothing. At first, anger burned inside him every day. Anger at the lies. Anger at his brother. Anger at his parents for sitting there while his life collapsed. Sometimes he would replay the courtroom scene in his head until it made him sick. But anger is heavy, and prison is already heavy enough. One afternoon, trying to escape the noise, he walked into the small prison library. It wasn't impressive. Old wooden shelves, torn books, dusty tables. But it was quiet. For the first time in weeks, his mind felt still. He picked up a law book. First, it was just curiosity. He wanted to understand what had happened to him, how evidence worked, how signatures were verified, how appeals were filed. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into years. While others played cards or counted down their sentences, Kofi read criminal law, corporate law, forensic evidence. He asked questions. He wrote notes. He helped other inmates draft letters and appeals. Slowly, people stopped seeing him as the greedy son, and started seeing him as the quiet man with answers. The anger didn't disappear, but it changed. Became focus. It became discipline. Every page he turned felt like he was building something invisible, something stronger than rage, stronger than shame. They had locked his body behind bars. But they didn't lock his mind, and without even realizing it, Kofi was preparing for a fight far bigger than prison. 2 years after Kofi was sent to prison, most people had forgotten about him. The headlines had moved on. New scandals, new gossip, new greedy sons to judge. But one person hadn't forgotten. Zenil Dubé didn't care much about viral stories. She cared about patterns, numbers, paper trails. She had been working on a bigger investigation about corporate corruption in Lagos. Shell companies, offshore accounts, fake contracts. The deeper she dug, the more one name kept appearing in old audit reports. Adeyemi Construction. At first, she thought it was just another powerful company cutting corners. But when she pulled the public court records of Kofi Adeyemi's case, something felt off. Too clean. Too perfect. She printed the audit timelines and spread them across her desk. Red circles. Yellow highlights. Sticky notes everywhere. According to the prosecution, the illegal transfers were approved by Kofi late at night over several weeks. His digital signature appeared on every document. Emails were sent from his account within minutes of each transaction. It looked airtight. But then Zenil checked something simple: travel records. She requested flight data through a confidential source. It took weeks of calls and favors. When the documents finally arrived, she sat back in her chair and stared at them. On 3 of the biggest transfer dates, Kofi wasn't even in Nigeria. He was overseas. One timestamp showed a transfer approved at 11:42 p.m. Lagos time, but immigration records proved Kofi had landed in London that evening and was still in the air at the exact time the email was sent. She blinked. That wasn't a small mistake. That was impossible. Her heart started beating faster. How did no one see this? She whispered to herself. She went deeper. More inconsistencies appeared. IP addresses that didn't match Kofi's usual devices. Approval patterns that started months before he ever raised concerns about the company's accounts. Audit reports quietly amended just days before the trial. The more she uncovered, the clearer it became. This wasn't just embezzlement. This was setup. And the scariest part, the evidence had been sitting there the whole time, hidden in plain sight, buried under confidence and family reputation. Zenil leaned back in her chair and looked at Kofi's old mugshot on her laptop screen. The media had called him the greedy son. The court had called him guilty. But numbers don't lie. And for the first time in 2 years, a small crack had appeared in the story everyone believed. Somewhere inside a prison cell, Kofi had no idea that outside those walls, the truth had just taken its first breath. The deeper the investigation went, the uglier the truth became. 4 years, money had been quietly disappearing from Adeyemi Construction. Not in one big dramatic theft. Well, it was smart. Small amounts at first. Spread across fake vendors, inflated project costs, offshore accounts registered under different names. Whoever was doing it knew exactly how the system worked. And there was only one person who had that level of access without raising suspicion. Damilola, the golden son. While Kofi was busy reviewing contracts and trying to expand the company the right way, Damilola had been living fast. New cars, private parties, expensive trips that didn't match his official salary. People thought it was just the lifestyle of a rich businessman's son. It wasn't. When Zenil traced the offshore accounts, one name kept appearing in coded form. Initials, nickname. But the connections were clear. The transfers led back to someone inside the family. Then came the part that hurt the most. Solomon Adeyemi found out. It happened months before Kofi's arrest. An internal audit flagged suspicious activity. Solomon confronted Damilola privately. There were arguments behind closed doors. Raised voices late at night. Their mother crying in the hallway. They knew. They knew their younger son had been siphoning millions. But exposing him would destroy everything. the company's reputation, family name, the image of success they had built for decades. Investors would panic, contracts would collapse, the media would tear them apart, and Damilola, he would go to prison. So they made a choice. Not a mistake. Choice. Kofi had already started asking questions about the finances. He had already noticed irregularities. That made him dangerous, but it also made him the perfect scapegoat. If the blame fell on him, the story would make sense. The serious older brother, secretly greedy. The trusted executive who abused his position. It was believable, clean, contained. They altered documents, shifted digital trails, allowed false evidence to grow. And when the case went to court, they didn't hesitate. They testified. They watched their firstborn son stand there alone. All to protect the younger one. All to protect the family name. Some betrayals happen in anger. Some happen by accident. This one was calm, calculated, silent. They didn't scream at Kofi. They didn't publicly disown him. They simply let the system take him. And while he was learning to survive inside prison walls, the real culprit was still sleeping in a luxury bedroom, protected by the very people who should have protected both their sons equally. The truth wasn't just painful. It was deliberate. When the story started cracking open, it needed more than a journalist. It needed a fighter in court. That's when Thierno stepped in. He wasn't loud. He wasn't flashy. But he had a reputation for one thing. He didn't take cases unless he believed something was wrong. After reading Zanil Dub's findings, he requested a prison visit. Kofi walked into the meeting room at Ikoyi Correctional Center expecting another empty promise. He had seen lawyers before. They all said, "We'll try." None of them changed anything. But Ba didn't start with sympathy. He placed a file on the table and said quietly, "You were not in the country during 3 of the transfers." Kofi froze. For the first time in years, someone wasn't asking if he did it. Someone was telling him he knew he didn't. That meeting lasted 4 hours. From that day on, Ba worked like a man obsessed. He filed motions to access company servers. He demanded original hard drives, not printed copies. He pushed for digital forensic testing on the signatures that had supposedly been Kofi's. What they found was explosive. Security footage from the company's finance office, previously unavailable during trial, suddenly surfaced after a court order. It showed Damilola entering the restricted accounts department late at night on multiple dates linked to the transfers. Then came the offshore accounts, hidden behind shell companies, layered through foreign banks. But forensic accountants traced the pattern. The money didn't disappear randomly. It moved in cycles, and eventually circled back to accounts connected to Damilola's private investments. The final blow was the email server analysis. Deleted emails were recovered. Metadata showed that Kofi's digital signature had been copied and pasted from older approved documents. Time-stamps had been manipulated. Login records revealed access from devices that were never registered to him. The so-called perfect evidence started falling apart piece by piece. Ba looked at the forensic report and said calmly, "This conviction is unsafe." That single sentence carried power. An official appeal was filed, not based on emotion, not based on sympathy, based on data. Science. Inside his prison cell, Kofi tried not to hope too much. Hope can be dangerous when you've been disappointed before. But something felt different this time. For the first time since the handcuffs clicked shut, the truth wasn't just a feeling in his chest. It was documented, verified, and it was heading back to court. The day of the retrial felt completely different from the first trial. Last time people came to watch Kofi fall. This time they came because something didn't add up. Outside the courthouse, cameras were everywhere. Reporters were pushing forward, calling his name. The same media houses that once called him the greedy son were now asking, was he framed? Social media was already exploding before the hearing even started. The night before, Zanil Dubé had published her biggest article yet. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't dramatic. It was detailed. Flight records, server logs, offshore transfers, security footage timestamps. She laid it all out clearly. By morning, the article had gone viral. People were sharing it with one sentence. What if we got it wrong? Inside the courtroom, the tension was thick. Kofi walked in wearing a simple suit, but this time he wasn't looking down. He wasn't broken. Years in Ikoyi Correctional Center had changed him. He looked calmer, stronger, like a man who had survived something heavy. Across the room sat his parents. Solomon Adeyemi looked confident at first, whispering to his lawyer. His mother held her handbag tightly, eyes fixed ahead. Then the forensic expert took the stand. The courtroom went silent. Step by step, the expert explained how digital signatures can be copied, how metadata reveals original creation times, how deleted emails can be restored. He displayed charts on a large screen. Login records showed access from devices not registered to Kofi. IP addresses traced back to internal office systems. Flight data proved Kofi was out of the country during key transactions. Gasps filled the room. This evidence, the expert said clearly, strongly indicates that the documents were manipulated and the signatures forged. You could feel the shift in the air. The judge leaned forward, studying the screen more carefully now. His expression changed. The same man who had once delivered a harsh sentence now looked unsettled. Kofi didn't look at the media. He looked at his parents. For the first time, his father's confidence cracked. A small bead of sweat rolled down his temple. His mother's hands were shaking. The story they had built so carefully was falling apart in public. And this time the whole country was watching. The retrial wasn't just about one man's freedom anymore. It was about the truth finally speaking, louder than lies ever did. The courtroom was so quiet that day you could hear people breathing. Everyone was standing as the judge walked in. Kofi's hands were steady, but his heart was racing. He had imagined this moment so many times inside his prison cell at Ikoyi Correctional Center. Sometimes in hope, sometimes in anger, sometimes not daring to imagine it at all. The judge adjusted his glasses and began to speak. After reviewing the new forensic evidence, the travel records, the digital analysis, and the financial trails, he said the words slowly and clearly. This court finds that the original conviction is unsafe. A wave of whispers spread through the room. Then came the sentence that changed everything. Kofi Adeyemi is hereby exonerated of all charges. For a second, Kofi didn't move, felt unreal, like sound had disappeared. Years of shame, years of being called a thief, years of sleeping behind bars. All lifted in one breath. He closed his eyes briefly, not to cry, just to breathe. But the judge wasn't finished. In light of the evidence presented, he continued, this court orders a full criminal investigation into Mr. Solomon Adeyemi and Mr. Damilola Adeyemi regarding financial misconduct and possible conspiracy. The room exploded. Reporters started typing furiously. Shocked voices. Even the lawyers looked stunned. Across the courtroom, his mother broke down completely. She covered her face and began to cry, not the quiet tears from before, but loud, shaking sobs. The weight of everything finally crashing down. Solomon Adeyemi sat frozen. The powerful businessman who once controlled boardrooms and courtrooms now looked smaller somehow, older. For the first time in years, he slowly turned his head and looked directly at Kofi. No anger, no pride, no authority, just shock. And something that looked almost like regret. Kofi held his father's gaze. There were 1,000 words he could have said. Questions. Accusations. Pain. But he didn't speak. He didn't need to. The truth had spoken for him. As officers approached Solomon and Damilola for formal questioning, the cameras flashed again, but this time the headlines were different. The greedy son was gone. In his place stood a man who had lost years of his life, and walked out with his name restored. Freedom felt different than he imagined. It wasn't loud. It was quiet. And this time, the silence belonged to him. Outside the courthouse, cameras and microphones were everywhere. Reporters shouted questions, pushing forward to get answers. The flash of cameras kept going, one after another, like they were trying to capture every emotion on his face. A journalist stepped closer. Kofi, do you forgive them? For a second he didn't answer. He looked at the crowd, at the microphones, at the people waiting for a dramatic moment. His expression stayed calm. Not angry, not broken, just tired in a way that only someone who had lost years could understand. "They sent me to prison to protect a lie," he finally said. His voice was steady. No shouting, no long speech, just the truth. Reporters tried to follow up. Questions came from every direction, about revenge, about family, about what he would do next. But Kofi didn't stay. He didn't argue. He didn't give sound bites for headlines. He simply walked past them. No extra words. No looking back. The cameras kept flashing, but he kept moving. Weeks passed. Investigations into financial misconduct and hidden transactions grew deeper. Evidence of corruption surfaced. Investors pulled out. Contracts disappeared. Trust collapsed. Eventually, Adeyemi Construction could not survive the storm. The company that once represented success and power fell under the weight of its own secrets. People talked about it everywhere. Online, in offices, in neighborhoods. Some blamed greed. Some blamed betrayal. Others wondered how things could have gone so wrong. Through it all, Kofi stayed silent. He had already said what needed to be said in court. The final line of the story spread across social media, repeated in articles and comments. "They buried my name to save their image." But truth doesn't stay locked up. It was more than a viral sentence. It was a reminder. Lies might hide things for a while, but in the end, truth always finds its way out.